It snowed again here in Utah. That's where I live. That's where the podcast is based out of, I suppose. But it snowed again here in Utah, which was a shock and a surprise for some people. I don't know why, because it's still February. But anyhow, it's the Energy is Love podcast, obviously. I always say obviously because you are tuning in and listening and subscribing and pushing play on the podcast for the universe. So everybody knows, at least everybody knows that's listening, that this is the Energy is Love podcast. If you have any doubt or questions about what the podcast is about, where you can listen to the podcast, where you can follow the podcast, just go to our website, energyislovepodcast.com. At energyislovepodcast.com, you will also find a link for our sponsors. If you click on that tab, one of the sponsors listed is As Above, So Below. As Above, So Below is a fun little metaphysical shop located in Roy, Utah. So if you live in Utah, obviously you probably know where Roy's at. Make a point next time you're through the area, maybe you live up north in the Ogden area, you can stop by As Above, So Below. There you will find anything and everything you could possibly desire, want, or imagine for your spiritual journey and growth. They have it at As Above, So Below. They also host events and classes on a regular basis. Coming up on March 24th, they're going to have a pendulum workshop. If you're a longtime fan of the podcast, you can remember way back we had Ingrid Maria on the podcast, Lady Luna, and she's the one that's going to be teaching that class. So that's going to be a good opportunity for you to come out, visit As Above, So Below, and then also learn about pendulums and how you can incorporate them into your spiritual practice or your life for that matter. Go check them out on Facebook. Like I said, if you click on the tab, sponsors on our website, and click on As Above, So Below, it'll take you right to their Facebook page where you'll be able to like and follow and keep up to date with everything that they're doing. On this episode of the podcast, I chat with Jeff Lieberman. Jeff is a graduate of MIT. He's got 4 different degrees from MIT. The list of things that this guy does is just kind of endless. He's an artist, a scientist, an engineer, a composer. I think he's a philosopher, even though he might not call himself that. But I found Jeff after doing a little bit of Google searching, and I came across a TED Talks that he did back in the day. It's been about 4 or 5 years ago. I just thought it was fascinating the way that he discussed the topics that he discussed during his TED Talk. So if you haven't found that, or if you haven't watched that, I encourage you going out and searching and finding it. We'll have a link to it on our Facebook page. You can go and follow it. So in this episode, we talked about so many different things. And what was really interesting is Jeff comes at a lot of different things from a much kind of from a deeper scientific point of view, but then he's also incredibly spiritual in kind of his thought process and the way that he views life and the reason behind life and the experience and time and all these different things we kind of got into. It was fascinating for me to sit back and listen to him. I really enjoyed the conversation. I have no doubt that you're going to walk away from listening with some different aspect of the universe kind of percolating in the back of your mind. So that's a good thing. You can go find Jeff at his website. It's Beast, which is BEA.ST. That's the website. He's got all of his information there. One of his latest projects, if you go to just Google Slow Dance on Kickstarter, and this is Jeff's latest project that he's got going on, and I don't even know really how to describe it, so go check it out. It's on Kickstarter right now. Remember, it's called Slow Dance, and there's a video of what it is and how to explain it, and the video does it justice. I could never do it justice with words. It's just one of those really fascinating, amazing things, and Jeff's the man behind that. So go check that out as well. Go check out his website. And for now, everybody gets to push play, sit back, relax, and enjoy this wonderful, fascinating episode with Jeff Lieberman on the Podcast for the Universe. Here we go.
You're listening to the Energy is Love podcast.
Energy is love.
The Energy is the Love podcast.
The Energy is Love podcast.
Energy is love.
The Energy is Love podcast.
The podcast for the universe.
The Energy is Love podcast.
No, good morning, Jeff.
Good morning, Craig.
It's Jeff Lieberman, right?
It is.
Thank you so much, man, for taking the time to sit down and do the podcast. I really, really appreciate it.
Yeah, my pleasure.
So I have like 1,001 questions that I want to ask you and things that I kind of want to dive into and get into. But first off, you're in Massachusetts, right? That's where you live?
Yeah, I'm in greater Boston area.
Are you originally from there, or where are you from?
No, I grew up in Miami, but I came to MIT for undergrad, and I never quite got out of the orbit.
Did you just kind of fall in love with it?
Yeah, I mean, I was at MIT for 10 years, and then pretty much everyone that I knew community-wise was here, so stuck around, and I think things have shifted over the last 15 years or so, but I've been here mostly, work and friends.
How old were you when you went to, how old were you when you came there?
I was 18, kind of 17 or 18. I forget what its standard is when you start freshman year.
Did you have because when you think about MIT, or when people hear MIT and they, do you know what I mean? Obviously it's a really well-known school and everything like that. Did you have any sort of apprehension, nervousness, or were we just like super excited to go?
Both. I was definitely nervous in the sense of like you're leaving high school and you have this is your opportunity to kind of like start over and have a new sense of self and a new sense of how you fit into your social dynamics and everything like that. I remember feeling the nerves a lot on the ride to the airport. But otherwise excitement. I mean, when you grow up in Miami, and especially in the 80s and 90s, and you're excited about math and physics, there's not a lot of people to talk to. Everyone there is pretty excited about the right tan and the right physique and things like that. And I was trying to talk to people about quantum mechanics. So when I showed up to MIT, and I could basically pull anyone aside in the hallway and ask about quantum mechanics, and they'd have some kind of baseline answer, that was kind of a revelation for me, to be in that kind of environment.
Was that something that you were always like drawn to and interested in, or?
As far as I can remember, knowing about what science and physics is, I remember being really interested, probably since I was 4 or 5. And all of us have those questions that we ask when we're 3 years old that annoy our parents when we keep asking why. And yeah, I think those questions still keep me up at night today.
Yeah, that's the big question, right? All those, why are we here? What are we doing? What's the purpose of this whole experience?
Totally. Who's asking the question? All that stuff.
So I found you. What happened was, because usually when it comes to the podcast, I'll get online and just start kind of scouring everything that I can think of in regards to kind of finding guests and everything. And I came across your TED Talks from a few years ago. And it was just fascinating. It was a really, really good, a good talk, I suppose is the best way to describe it. But the part that really got me was the whole concept and idea, because the way you describe it is really beautiful, and the way that you kind of dived into it during the talk and everything like that. But the idea that we can kind of end suffering through some sort of greater understanding of ourselves and awareness and our place in the universe and all those type of things that you kind of get into.
I'm glad you enjoyed it.
So when it comes to human suffering, that's such a huge, broad, like spectrum, right? Everybody falls on it, I think, in some way, shape, or form. But what do you think, or in your mind when you think about that, what part of kind of grasping some greater acceptance of the things that are out there that we may not fully understand, but we can embrace, how is that going to tie into kind of helping when it comes to human suffering and, even just people on their individual basis?
Well, I think it's important for me to start by saying 2 things. One, everything that I talk about is an open theory. I don't claim to know anything. I'm much more interested in the questions that keep me up than pretending in this podcast like I have any answers for anyone. So I'm just exploring this along with everybody else. That's the first thing. And then the second thing is to differentiate pain and suffering. Pain is a signal usually in your body to pay attention to something, to change something about your behavior, to fix something. I would define suffering as a resistance to whatever is happening to you. So you could be in a lot of pain. Someone can cut your arm or something like that, and you're going to experience pain. But are you also going to be resistant to the fact that you're in pain? That's a purely psychological form of suffering. That's just a resistance to what happens to be reality. And that's something that, as far as I know, only a human being can do. Other animals, when you see them get injured, they seem to attend to the injury. And we seem to try to distract ourselves from the fact that there's an injury there. So I think it's important to differentiate. I don't believe that there's an end to pain. In fact, people that have no pain receptors are hugely endangered by not having pain receptors because it's a really, really useful signal for your survival. So I don't believe pain should go away. I think it's really one of the most important signals that the body gives that something is out of alignment. So I'm all for pain and its possible utility. But I do find that many of the things that many of the ways that human beings relate to their own emotion that are happening is with a sense of resistance or rejection. And this is going to happen when you have a brain that can imagine alternate possibilities and realities, because if I can just distract myself from some painful situation in my life by going to whatever it is, maybe it's drugs, maybe it's scripture, maybe it's the internet, like all these things are the same to me. They're all a mechanism of distraction from some sort of thing that's not settled in yourself. And as soon as we as an organism and as a society have those kind of capabilities of getting away from our pain, psychologically we start to be able to prefer false realities to actually what's right in front of us. And that, I think, is one of the big transitions in consciousness that is taking place and has the potential to take place in a much deeper way through society.
The concept and idea that those alternate realities are those things that we can kind of distract ourselves with in our own mind. Do you think that is that what you're talking about? You think that's one of the big things that's taking place?
That's taking place, as well as people waking up to that fact. I think we've been doing that in, and I'm not talking about in the hills of Tibet, but I would say as a general world population, we actually kind of structure our society to try to have the best mechanisms of distraction from our pain and from our suffering. So that's happening in mass in society, and it seems like over the last 4,000 years or so, there have been certain people that have looked at that at its fundamental, wanted to actually look into the eye of the pain and to see how much of it we're creating for ourselves on top of it. And so I think there's these two movements happening. Society is getting more and more kind of on the precipice, on the brink, where we have more and more stuff, and actually it's not making people feel any better. It's making people feel a little more disconnected, a little less able to attend to their experience, to their closeness with their family, that sort of thing, a little more distracted. And I think people are slowly waking up to the fact that doesn't end well if we keep going down that path. If we find better and better distraction, it doesn't actually seem to ever get to the root of that little gnawing, little emptiness that a lot of people will feel as soon as they stop distracting themselves.
Do you think that that is somehow by design that we have that, because I think that aspect, that concept and idea that we have, that we distract ourselves from the present moment, right? I think that for the most part, or I think that it's probably evolutionary in a sense, where that was something that we created, along the journey of man and the way that we evolved and everything like that. And after we took care of like survival and, do you know what I mean, coexistence with other humans and all those type of things that kind of just happened along the path of evolution, we got to this point where we had to somehow distract ourselves. And so I wonder if it's by design in a sense where it served a purpose at one point in our history, and now we're at the point where, do you know what I mean, we just completely went over the top with it, to the point like you're talking about with, technology and the society and the way that it's now used to distance ourselves so much from that present moment and from ourselves.
Yeah, I would say, not everything that happens in evolution serves a fundamental purpose, but a lot of the things that come up in evolution are side effects to things that served a really deep purpose for evolution. So you could say that, for example, the ability to imagine an alternate reality where something like a plane exists before a plane actually has been made, and to be able to line up the million steps that it's going to take to design and invent a plane, that requires you being able to leave the reality that's in front of you and imagine an alternate reality and actually construct and break down the steps at which to gain that reality and manifest it in this earth. So the capability is critical as soon as you're a tool-wielding organism, because you have to be able to kind of anticipate things that are multiple steps away. And if you look at most other animals, there's not this kind of like 40-step planning. To make a plane literally takes millions of steps to make something like that. So I think what happened, a lot of people theorize that as soon as we had agriculture, something like 20,000 years ago, was the first time where we actually had a food surplus. So it was the first time that we actually had free time. most of the time before then was probably spent hunting, gathering, and making sure we actually were sustained. So as soon as you have that come around, then you have free time, but you've also been developing this capability to imagine alternates to what's in front of you. And so it seems like the side effect that happened is that when we were in pain, we could use that imagination to temporarily lower our pain. And it's one of these things, just like a lot of habit forming gurus will say, like, you have to go through a short period of pain in habit change in order to be at a place that actually serves you better overall. I think this was the first time probably in human history where we were able to actually not take the long road to feeling better, which might have actually settled the things fundamentally, but instead able to just have these moments of, breath, brief moments away from that pain through distraction. So it seems like a very powerful tool and a very dangerous one at the same time.
Yeah, there's definitely two sides to it for sure.
Yeah, the what's it called? Spider-Man, with great power comes great responsibility. This feels really applicable here.
Throughout your education and schooling and everything like that, because you're so, essentially you're going into all of these science-based topics and all these things. At what point did you branch out and start to look at things in a different way, or try to understand, or try to meet some, do you know what I mean? Find that place in the middle where we can combine science and consciousness and spirituality and some of these things that we don't necessarily can't define or understand.
For me, there's no greater motivator than pain. And for me, that pain was through depression, I would say probably from when I was 15 to 30 or, maybe even 34 or something like that. I was, grew up in a super privileged economy, family, all that sort of thing, had what I needed, went through the typical Maslow hierarchy of getting more and more things that I thought I needed to be happy, getting the right job, getting the right girl, the house, all that kind of stuff. And in the background, there was just this gnawing kind of something is still not settled. And I think in the long run, this was one of the deepest blessings in my life. But obviously, during those years, it was really, really trying, really difficult. And I wouldn't say that the difficulties are over by a long shot. It's just that I have a different perspective on them. When I was about 30 was when all of that, I think, kind of came to a head, where I really felt like I just had all the stuff on the list and was feeling just as empty when I looked for it, So I was constantly distracting myself like we all do. But in those moments, when you have a depression or something that kind of is persistent, you can't permanently get away from it. You can kind of put it at bay for a little while, but you're usually dealing symptomatically with what's going on. And so this thing kept coming back, and and as soon as I had turned everywhere to the external world to try to find help for that, that's when I started realizing that it was about my own belief systems and my own attitudes and about life. And I would say the deepest belief systems are the belief systems that are in your body, and they're not even in your conscious mind, right? They're belief systems about things like the safety of Earth, and has your body, when it grew up on this planet, did it learn that this planet was a safe place? Because if it didn't, no matter what you think in your mind, your body is going to be terrified underneath the surface, and that's going to really deeply change the way that you act in the world. So anyway, long story short, I think depression really taught me all of these things, and I had looked to kind of standard Western thought and psychology to try to understand where I was, and only when I kind of felt like I had exhausted those possibilities and started looking into things like meditation and spirituality did I start to see what I felt like was more of the root of these issues.
How deep did the depression get? Did you go, was it, because I think everybody suffers from one form of mental illness or another. I think that the whole label and term is kind of a misnomer, and it's just a big spectrum and everybody falls on it. Sometimes it's just, mild depression, every few months or whatever the case may be. And then on the other end of the spectrum, you have, schizophrenia and all those other type of more heavily impactful illnesses. But I think that when it comes to you, how dark did it get in your depression? Was it something that was super chronic that would, do you know what I mean? Or was it more or less just this nagging thing that you couldn't shake free from?
It definitely, waxed and waned over the years, but I would say if I was less of a rational person, I may have attempted suicide or something in high school. There was definitely a lot of hopelessness at that point. I was such a rational thinker at the time that I just felt like, okay, no matter what, if I kill myself now, I'm never going to understand what this is. And if I can just spend more time and look into this, and I can always do that later. And that's maybe it's a weird path to start things off, but, I really felt like that held true for a long time. And I think a lot of the time when I go into different work that really is uncovering kind of, generational trauma and that sort of work within my own body, I still have that attitude like, hey, look, I'm still just trying to figure this out, just trying to understand really how one's consciousness is constructed in the first place. And where do it's very hard when you're in one body your whole life to know the extent to which people feel fundamentally different. I think, people talk about the hard problem of consciousness, like do two people seeing something that's red see the same thing? I think something that's maybe more practical is to think like, is the level of comfort I have being in my own skin, is that the same as how everyone else feels? And then when you start looking around at people, you can start to see that there's a wide range of comfort in one's own skin.
Well, that concept and idea, like, I don't even know if I've necessarily even thought about it that way or asked myself that question. How comfortable am I in my own skin? And then I sit there and think about that real quick, and I can go back throughout my life and think of times when I'm, I would say very comfortable in that space. And then other times where you're just like, do you know what I mean? You hate every aspect of where you're currently at and kind of yourself. And so I think that, that's an interesting concept, that just that thought of how comfortable are we in our own skin and in our own kind of life and body and experience of where we're at.
Yeah. And I don't want to give the misrepresentation that one should always feel comfortable. I back to the earlier comments about pain. I think when your life needs a change or a course correction or something like that, I think those signals are uncomfortable. When you're feeling the desire to shift something in your life, but then you have every belief system about the way your life's supposed to have been and all that sort of thing. Like, of course there's going to be internal conflict and tensions there that have to kind of be felt through discomfort and stress. In some sense, stress is one of those things that motivates us to change and to move. So I still think that's really a powerful thing and a beautiful thing. But when we start rejecting our own feelings, that's when I think a lot of new kind of problems come up. Like, for example, depression. When you look at depression from different lenses, a lot of different kind of attitudes come up. And when I, for example, saw a doctor about depression when I was, something like 15, we just started to get into the things that were going on and all that sort of thing. And, it was probably 20 years later when I talked to someone about a history of depression, and they immediately said, well, depression is often connected to repressed anger. And that just like lit up so many things immediately in my body that I had no idea were there. And this was a couple of years ago at this point. So it started to kind of percolate and integrate through my system. But depression is oftentimes one of these things where you have an enormous amount of anger about many things, potentially family life, mistreatment, all this kind of thing. But you don't actually feel safe expressing that anger outward. For example, like if you're in the Holocaust or something like that, you're going to be super, super angry about what's happening to you as an oppressed person. But you can't say that out loud. It's too dangerous. And so you actually have a feeling in yourself that you have to reject for your own safety. And as soon as that happens, you kind of have your foot on the gas and your foot on the brake at the same time. Anger is this enormously powerful energy, and you have exactly the same amount of power clenching that down and holding it in place. And a lot of the time when you do something like that, the anger that wanted to get out has to go somewhere and just turns back at yourself. And so you start getting angry at yourself. There's a lot of the cycle of depression. At least in my history, it became very, very clear as soon as that was exposed to me that was a huge part of the dynamic, but it was totally invisible to me growing up.
So were you able to kind of go back and look at those moments in your life and experiences that you'd gone through that the anger had kind of stemmed from?
Oh, absolutely. And not only go back, but I think you have to go, for me at least, I believe that you have to go into the body and you have to renegotiate those pathways in your nervous system. You have to show your body that it's actually okay to express those things now. It's not enough to say like, oh, such and such happened, that's why I was angry. No, because when you were angry, you're in a child consciousness. You have an emotion and you're clenching it with the opposite thing. And those two things pushing against each other kind of get stuck. And so no matter what, later on, those two things are like unconsciously pushing against each other, sapping your conscious energy away and kind of having this internal fight that you might stop noticing after a while. And so it's really like your nervous system, your somatic intelligence, as opposed to something like your conceptual intelligence, has to actually learn that kind of movement of energy is safe for your body to express. And that's a kind of learning that I feel like is much, much deeper than conceptual understanding of what happened to you on the way. I'm not disregarding that. I think it's really, really great to make a narrative that constructs where you're at and where you might go and all that sort of thing. But I think if the body, and you could say if your reptilian part of your system, the most base part of your brain that's controlling all these instincts and intuitions, if that part doesn't learn that the expression of anger is safe, then no conceptual understanding of that is going to change the fact that you're going to hold that energy in your body tight.
So what helped you in that space, not just going through that process? What were some of the things? Because you mentioned earlier, like meditation and stuff like that. Had you ever, experienced any of those type of, I don't even know what to call them, things, I guess, things that you do to try to help manage and cope and deal with?
Yeah, and I think, I'll say what's been effective for me, but I think it's important for people to look around and figure out what might be right for them.
Oh, for sure.
But there's a lot of somatic-based traditions, meditation and healing traditions that have been, I think, really exposing and powerful for me. There's systems like that all stem from kind of the Wilhelm Reich tradition, if you're familiar with that, which, Reichian therapy, from 100 years ago went through like Alexander Lowen and bioenergetics, people like Peter Levine, and somatic experiencing. There's this whole school of, you could say school of thought, which is ironic because it's all about the body, but schools of thought about how these trauma, and I don't just mean like acute trauma, like one-time car accident type of trauma. I mean the daily trauma that a child experiences in their home if their home is not unconditionally loving, which is most people's homes. That stuff is learned on this, reptilian level of your system. And there's these systems like bioenergetics, that can teach your body to find safety again and teach your body how to express through those pathways. But you bring up actually what to me is like one of the greatest riddles right now, which is there are so many forms of healing and meditation and so many people that would benefit really deeply from these forms, and figuring out what would be the right thing for a person, I think, is one of the biggest puzzles of our time right now. You have this matching problem of person has such and such symptoms, such and such story, such and such goals in life. And then there's these 100,000 forms of healing and meditation that exist. Like, what are the three that are the most likely ones to resonate with that person's system? It would be really nice, because most people that I know spent the first 5 years just hopping around blindly trying to find their way through the space.
Yeah, I agree. There's definitely, what I think when it comes to all the different types of energy healing modalities or things that exist out there, I think at the core of them, they all stem from kind of the same basic concept and idea and belief that, we all have this internal energy, we're all connected. And when you're working with that, or if you're seeing somebody or somebody's helping you through the process, they're just connecting through that energy. But then everybody has taken that kind of base form and made it their own and worked with it in their own way and labeled it something different. And now we do have all of these different things that exist. And then, a lot of times people can get overwhelmed in that space of trying to figure out what's going to suit me best and what's going to help me.
Yeah, I found a really funny thing. I gave that TEDx talk probably 5 years ago now, and I still get emails like yours, for example, all the time. And the emails kind of come into two different categories. Yours is an exception. Most of them come down to two categories. One category is someone who teaches some kind of tradition of healing or meditation, and they always write me to tell me that this is the way. Basically, if anyone wants to experience unity and oneness, I have the way.
Yeah, they figured it out.
That's class one. They got it. And the irony, it's very possible that those people really did find something really meaningful, but most of us have this kind of false, not postmodern experience where we think that other people's experience will be like our experience. And so if we had this thing, then it's going to work for everybody, and it's going to be the thing. So the first class of letters I get is almost always, it's about that, tradition X, this is the way. Anyone that needs to know this, take them to tradition X. And then the second class of people that write me are on the other side, and they say, I had some experience that exposed me to what you're talking about, and now I feel it, but it hasn't integrated, or it's not persistent, or whatever. What tradition should I be following, or what healing modality should I be following? And at this point, I've gotten hundreds of letters on both sides of people saying, I got the thing, and people saying, what is the thing? And I'm still just flabbergasted at trying to figure out how to match up anything with anyone, Yeah. Because people are so unique. And as I've learning more about like the Reichian tradition, there's a thing called character styles where you can kind of like look at the many different ways that energy gets trapped in the system. And I think it might be worth saying, like, we talk about, I think the community talks about spirituality a lot of the time like it's this very, very far off, something that none of us are accustomed to. And I think in another sense, if you look at any baby that is, a newborn or infant, like, it's very easy to see that there's no internal conflict in their system. It's very easy to see in some sense that they're just like a reverberation of the universe. They have no personal will that is separate from the will of the body or of the universe. And that takes like almost 2 years to start forming. So in some sense, that kind of Kundalini awakening, or this like pure energy transmission through a human body, I think is the natural state. It's the natural state of us as animals. It's something that every animal is doing all the time. It's not some other like thing that you don't find. It's actually the kernel of what your experience is right now. It's just that it's usually covered up with all these other conflicts and belief systems. So I think there's a lot of deep hope over the long term to figure out ways to help people match up with these kind of modalities. But so I can only speak to my own experience.
Well, what helped you? Like, what was it that you said in the beginning, you kind of just were absorbing all these kind of different ideas and concepts? What was it that eventually kind of helped you fine tune, where you were going to direct your attention and focus? Because granted, we're always open to new concepts and ideas, and we're always constantly kind of looking for information and insight and all those kind of things. But I think at some point, not just in life or your spiritual journey or path or whatever the case may be, you kind of have to choose, I'm going to walk this way for now, fully accepting the fact that I may turn left or right at some point, but for now I'm going to walk this way.
Totally. I think there's been kind of two main chapters so far in that search. When I was 30, I'm 38 now. And when I was 30 was when I started getting into meditation and really just like diving in, because really there were no other alternates at that point. I kind of looked everywhere else. So that opened me really deeply up to meditation. And I went eventually down the Advaita Vedanta path, which is teachers like Nisargadatta, Ramana Maharshi. And it's a pretty extreme path in the sense of kind of like obliterate every object in consciousness and see yourself as the pure subject, et cetera, et cetera. And I would say I practiced that kind of work for, something like 6 years. And at the end of that, and I'm not saying I finished any work or that I'm in any way done with anything. But at the end of my kind of more intensive relationship with that, I really felt like my relationship with my thoughts was changed, that there was less ruminating about things, that there was a less belief that my thoughts were fundamentally true about anything, just kind of seeing them and as objects, disidentification. The funny thing about that is, when you hear about all these stories of spiritual teachers and things like that, there's so often this moment where the sky opens up and God speaks to them, and then all of a sudden, like, everything in their life is just permanently amazing. I've never had that happen. I think my own mental holding on to that was ever going to be something that was going to happen, really slowed down some of the actual learning that was happening, because I was like forecasting some kind of event.
Were you waiting for that to kind of happen?
I think for a while. I think probably with most meditators, the first stage is notice how much you're looking for some kind of outcome. However many years that takes to notice, however many crashes you have to have. I feel like every time I go on some retreat or something like that, it's that you have a breakdown because you have to let go of some belief that you've held onto for a long time. It's not this like super joyous thing until the moment after you let go it. And then you're like, whoa, I didn't need this whole belief my whole life, but there I was holding on to it forever.
But think about, if you practice meditation and if it's something that you've done for quite some time, you definitely have had to experience moments where you go to this space where, putting it into words is incredibly challenging and difficult because so much of it is like a feeling and a sensation where you go someplace and you feel some connection or correlation or even just some presence of something that is powerful or more powerful than you. And you feel connected to it, and vice versa, where it kind of where it feels connected to you, and you have some sensation and remembrance of that space and that experience. You just have a really hard time contextually explaining it in words and bringing it back. Would you say that you've experienced something like that?
Yeah, and I would say, we might all have like a different benchmark of what that experience is, but for certain, even within your first meditation sit, there is a variation in your experience, right? There's like a variation even on the axis of like quietness and loudness of the mind. So even in there, like, I think, if we get rid of the whole, like, I'm going to have some moment of the sky opening up, I can notice that there's a refinement and subtlety to my attention kind of focusing in or becoming more spacious or getting louder or getting quieter. And it's like, I think just even noticing that that's a possibility is a really deep thing. If you get open to the fact that there's a variation in my ability to connect with something that is not just my mind, that could be wonderful if we didn't have expectations about some kind of explosion happening.
What if that was the explosion, though? So I'm sitting here thinking, because you're right, you've got all these spiritual gurus and masters and over the years and centuries and things like that do reference and talk about, the sky opening up and speaking with God or the eternal light of, the universe or whatever the case may be. But what if it's because they've been able to let go of that concept and idea? So when we go into meditation and we're kind of seeking that space where we want to connect with whatever higher power exists out there, and we can kind of continually chasing that. But if we were able to let go of that concept and idea and just accept the fact that, it's incredibly easy to connect to that space, and the reality is we're probably always connected to that space, but not thinking that somehow, my experience hasn't quite achieved the level of your experience or that spiritual guru's experience when they're talking about it. And the difference, the difference is they have just been able to let go of that idea that there's going to be something more.
Yeah, in some sense, when you use the metaphor that Alan Watts uses of life being a piece of music, and he says, the goal of music is not to get to the end of the music. If that were the case, then everyone would go to the concert hall and everyone would play as fast as possible, and then you hear the cymbal crash, and everyone would be super excited that it was over. It's obvious in that metaphor that there's something really wrong with that. But in our life, we often very, very deeply hold off our well-being for some imagined future. And that's totally a construction in our head, and it's usually based on beliefs that were given to us through our parents and society and the culture at large. And we can go from like a product to a process model where we're in constant growth. But to be in a state like you're referring to, where I think of it as a state of constant learning and growth, it kind of requires the losing of this belief that you're going to land somewhere. And to me, I think the most extreme case of what you're saying is like when I when I talk to people about really basic disidentification of the mind, like having a thought and noticing it's a thought, if you can make someone feel confused, that to me is potentially the end. Because if someone's confused about something that a moment before they took for granted about their experience, that's the seed, right? And if the seed catches if the confusion catches their curiosity, that's never going to end, right? They're going to fall into this search of who they are, and as far as I can tell, that search just continually unfolds new dimensions all the time. There's this really beautiful line that Nisargadatta said. He was a super fiery guy. I don't know how many of your listeners will have been exposed to Nisargadatta, but if you look him up on YouTube or something, you can just see him kind of yelling at everybody. And people will ask him a question, and he'll basically just yell at them. Your question is based on a false assumption about your reality, and so I'm going to slash your whole false assumption about reality because I can't answer your question. But he's talking to this guy, and the guy says, "Why should I do all these practices when at the end of the search, there's just going to be me, the searcher, sitting around?" And Nisargadatta says, "No, you have it backwards. At the end, the searcher disappears, and the only thing that's left is the search." And that just blew my mind, to realize that this thing that's thinking it's going to land and find this thing, that construction in consciousness can dissolve. And then the search can continue, but with no story about the search landing in some place.
Yeah, that's kind of it's a deep one.
It's a deep one, yeah.
Yeah. I mean, it's the whole idea too, because for me in my own path, my own journey, whatever, I always hate calling it that. I think it's just my life, right? Just my life. But in my life, I've gotten to these points where, I accept the fact that I don't believe I'm dead or that I die or that I end and that my energy continues on. And just that whole concept and idea that even, being born into the body that I'm in now, that's not when I began. And, that whole concept is just so ginormous for people to try to grasp. And then I always, because I'm such a big fan of challenging my own belief or my own concepts and my own ideas of do you know what I mean? And so I even sit with that concept and idea of maybe that is when I began. And when I die, I simply die and I'm done and I end. But even sitting in those spaces of kind of contemplating those things and thinking about the what ifs and imagining all the things, if that is the case, I still always come back to that kind of deeper thing of I have to go on further. And it's not because, it's like what you're saying, that search does continue. I think even if we at some point get to that place where we stop, being the searcher of it and stop being that thing that's continually searching for what's next and getting to the next level and the next point. But I definitely think we do just continually, perpetually move forward in life.
Yeah, and just to make it super ubiquitous every day, I think everyone knows moments where they lose themselves in what they're doing, where they're either playing music or they're making love or they're cooking or whatever, where there's some gap where maybe it's literally 3 seconds, maybe it's an hour where they have stopped thinking about themselves because they're so involved in what's going on. Now, to me, that's the end of the searcher, right? There's a search that's happening. There's a process. Maybe it's a sexual process. Maybe it's a musical process, whatever. The process is so present in attention that there's no time to notice that you're doing the thing. I think a lot of us, you were mentioning basketball when we were talking earlier, this happens all the time in sports. Where, at the end, you're like, what just happened for an hour? I had no time to think about myself. And this is something that every cat and dog know every moment of their lives because they don't sit around and think about themselves ever, right? There's just life happening. And so I think it's a funny thing when we talk about the searcher, that since we conflate so often our personalities with the body, it's very hard to imagine how could the searcher not be here. But we all actually know plenty of moments where the searcher isn't there, where we're just wrapped in life, where we're just living.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's the point. Do you know what I mean? When I sit down and think about what am I going to do, or what's the purpose, and that's the other thing too, is I think that there's always so many different reasons and explanations for things. So because of the vastness of space and time and the universe and everything, I think that everything is really multidimensional. And so I think it's really limiting to think that, maybe one purpose or one reason or one outcome of this experience is to get to that point where we kind of let go of everything and just continue on and accept that. But then I also think that there's purpose and reason behind the very concrete, real things that we're doing here in these human forms and bodies and things like that.
Yeah, I feel like I went so far on the kind of non-dual path that I didn't give any credence to the material world, and the fact that I was right now in a body, and there was right now this world that has things going on. And it's very easy to kind of like disassociate from the world and find peace and clarity and unity, but to actually find it integrated with all the messiness of the world is a whole different prospect. And I think it's very, very easy along the meditative path and traditions to kind of like cut yourself off from the messiness in order to find that bliss and that peace. But for me, that didn't land. And you were asking before about the kind of things that I felt were effective for me. And, the end of the meditative tradition for me, or I should say not the end because I still meditate, but the end of it being the whole story for me was when my relationship with the voice in my head changed, and still there was chronic pain in my body. I felt like I disidentified from thinking, and I could find the quiet and the peace. But for some reason, there's all this pain in my body. Why didn't the sky open up and like rip my back open and make me feel all powerful like it happens in all the stories? So all of a sudden, all of my attention, I think really deeply, ironically, went right into the body, which is the thing that I was kind of like devaluing in my meditative practice. All of a sudden, it became the most important thing. And I think when you're talking about the search, and we're talking about the kind of process that goes on, whether or not there's a searcher, I think there's something to be said about fear. We have so many fears in our body about bodily death, but then also really deep fears about social constructions, right? It's really funny. I feel like when, I forget the exact statistic, but when people were asked about the things that they were most afraid of, in a large poll, public speaking actually was higher than death, right? There's like, this has no relevance to a tiger, right? But we've got all these beliefs now about social pressures and shame and guilt and all this sort of thing that are pretty unique to humanity. And I think that for me, there's all this bodily work. To me, the most effective thing has been anger work. Alexander Lowen in one of his books actually has a chapter that's called Anger, the Healing Emotion, which I think we give something like anger a really bad name in our culture because it's usually just people that can't control their emotions, can't keep themselves from hurting other people. But I think there's actually just as many people in our world that don't know how to express anger. And so they're actually expressing anger at themselves all the time because they're holding this thing in that doesn't feel safe to let out.
I want to give you my take on anger. Because in my journey, or in my life, I'm going to stop saying my journey. In my life, I've experienced, so many different things. And I think when I started to really look at anger and address it, I came to believe and understand or think about it in a way where anger really wasn't a true emotion, where it wasn't really valid in a sense. Because I always felt like the anger that I was expressing or feeling or holding on to really just masked the things that were underneath it. And then once I really started to kind of look into it further and dive into it deeper, it was really, the anger was just the manifestation of the hurt and the pain and the sadness and the shame, and the feeling of not being loved really at the end of the day. And so that was really just my way of masking all of those things and hiding all of those things as kind of like a defensive mechanism.
Yeah.
And I think people do that so much. I think that people, especially men, I think it's really common in men to initially respond with anger in regards to things. And it's because they have a hard time expressing some of the finer nuances and deeper meanings behind, what they're really feeling. And so it's such an easy thing to jump to is just anger, and then very much so just masking things and covering things up. And like you've said, where, they hold on to that anger and then there's no outlet for it. So it does just eventually turn back on themselves.
Yeah. And I think the nervous system works in really interesting ways where we'll have like an emotion, like you're saying, protecting us from feeling another emotion. Like anger can be an easier thing to feel than deep grief or heartbreak or deep terror. So I agree with you. There's this kind of like layering of emotions, as we get to be adults. We start, the only emotion you can have as a little infant is everything's blissful or everything's terrible. Right? It's pretty black and white. It's like things are good or they're not good. And you can't express anger, for example, in the first year of your life. You don't have the kind of intellectual mechanism to even understand what would lead to anger, because you don't have a sense that actually separates your body from other bodies and boundaries being crossed and all that sort of thing. But what I think is really fascinating about our nervous systems is, for example, my system learned that anger was not safe. That if I expressed anger, I'd actually be punished for expressing that anger. There would be retaliation. And so it's necessary. It felt necessary, and it still feels necessary for me to constantly go into the work of anger expression. Whether that's hitting a pillow or working with a bioenergetics practitioner or whatever, getting that pathway in my nervous system actually able to get out. And what I find, and this is really similar to what I think you're getting at, what I find is that when I express that anger, it shows all this other stuff that's going on, but it felt like that stuff wouldn't be exposed unless the anger had a chance to actually move out of the system instead of kind of getting caught in a cycle inside.
Yeah. What is what you keep referencing bioenergetics?
Bioenergetics is Alexander Lowen's kind of recapitulation of Wilhelm Reich's original work into character structures. And, basically the one sentence version of Wilhelm Reich. Wilhelm Reich was a contemporary of Freud's. He was the head of the American Psychological Association something like 100 years ago. And then they got into like a feud because Freud was doing all this mind work, story work. And Reich started to say that the trauma actually that you go through stays in your body. It's not just in your mind. And when you see people with chronic tensions in their bodies, it's actually because they have a chronic resistance to a certain form of emotional expression. And that gets caught in the body. And there's a ton of research coming out in the last 30, 40 years that corroborates this stuff. Bessel van der Kolk just came out with a book in the last couple of years called The Body Keeps the Score. And it's about all these different somatic therapies for trauma reduction and stuff like that. And it's really quite incredible how much of your beliefs live in your body and not in your mind, and kind of only come out when you actually allow the body to express that set of emotions and beliefs.
So do you think do you think it's an accurate thing where everything that we experience in life in some way, shape, or form, that energy that exists from that experience will pass through our body and either, fulfill us and help in a positive way, or stay stagnant and stuck?
Yeah, I think a lot of people in these kind of traditions use the metaphor of like a river that sometimes forms little whirlpools off to the side. And this idea that you have energy that's always coming up and through you and wanting to express. But if you have fears that don't allow that channel through, you actually hold some of that stuff in these eddy currents. And you can be, I have felt at times in my life that more than half of the energy in my body was constrained by somatic belief system. And the first couple times I actually had any chance to let anger out, which was, only a year or two ago, after 30 something years of never ever feeling like it was safe to express anger in my life, only after letting some of that stuff out did I realize how much of your power and your determination and your motivation is actually part of allowing your own system to express anger. And it's not that like people should go run around and be angry all the time. It's that when you were treated badly growing up, which everyone's got some of these experiences, right? You're not treated the way you want to be treated. You just learn that certain things aren't okay to express. And it's like, no matter how free someone is in their mind, they might still come up to a situation like, for example, like public speaking or something like that. No matter how free you are in your mind, you still might come to a public speaking thing and your body may just totally shut down. And that's not something that necessarily can only be worked in on the mental layer.
Yeah. My brain got lost thinking about all the things that you were saying.
I know, me too. There's like so many things to go into.
Do you have, so if you've got this background in science and everything like that, has it been difficult for you to kind of meld the two things where you have to question things so much from kind of like an analytical standpoint? Or are you really able to kind of, do you know what I mean, find some happy place where you just accept it for what it is and not necessarily have to quantify it and understand it completely?
There's a couple things. I've definitely, my skepticism from my 20s has definitely turned into like very critical open-mindedness, where pretty much anything I hear is possible. And even things, the funniest thing to me is sometimes people will explain something that's happening and they're having some miraculous thing happening, and I won't even believe their explanation, but I'll believe that what they're talking about is happening. Right? I think even our own mental constructs of explaining what's going on doesn't need to be right for the experience to be right. And I know in some of the somatic work that I've done, when you go into an emotion that your body doesn't think is safe, and you're in a safe enough environment that you're allowed to let that thing out, there's something just totally, absolutely undeniable that changes in your system. And it's literally a bodily thing. It's like finding out that you have a third foot or something like that. You just start to feel your own sensational body in a way that you weren't able to feel before. And there's just something incontrovertible and undeniable about that fact when it happens. And I'm not saying I understand the mechanisms for that process, but definitely when your nervous system has been blocking energy in some way and you allow that pathway to start to emerge, you feel new aspects of your life come back online. You know, you feel those hidden reserves of energy and power come back into your system, which is a really beautiful thing. I really wish, one of my deepest dreams is that we figure out in our culture how to do this with each other. Instead of having to pay a ton of money to find the people that know how to do this, how do we self-form into groups of people that learn how to work with each other to create these safe environments and actually open up all these things with each other? Because as soon as you're in an environment where people feel safe to do that, it's miraculous how open people's nervous systems can become.
Have you found anything close to that? Like, do you ever go to, groups or meetings or anything like that where they're, because I've gone to a lot of like spiritual groups, right? So they'll meet, on a monthly basis or whatever the case may be. And maybe the focus is like a meditation or a drum circle or whatever the case may be. And you go into those spaces and it's like maybe 75% of the people can be in that really open, loving space of just acceptance. But then you still have some people that are like stuck in their shit and they don't want to completely let go. So it kind of messes up the vibration or whatever. Do you know what I mean?
Really, it's really tricky. I almost feel like as this kind of thing hopefully becomes more commonplace in our culture, there'll be like, you'll go to like beginners classes, like beginner vulnerability classes. And then as soon as you like feel okay sharing anything, you'll go into the intermediate classes where people are starting to show grief. And, when you go to the advanced classes, people will be like unleashing 500-year-old terror from in slavery and things like that. I have seen all those flavors at this point through group work, and I would put a little caveat where I think there's also a pitfall of like catharsis movements, which kind of put a lot of weight on having this like moment of emotional release that doesn't sometimes seem to get integrated into your system permanently. But I have my whole attitudes about my own ability to be vulnerable have changed really deeply from being vulnerable in a group of, for sometimes I think I've broken down in a group where there's like 60 people in the room, and when you actually, I think this is a magical thing. When you, against all your beliefs and all your resistances, have something come up and break you open in front of 50 people, and then they all actually become closer to you and more loving and more, and you feel that safety. Something something shifts in your system, and I think that's something that we've really lost in our community in the last however many thousands of years. Like when you look at tribal cultures, like there's an intense bodily groundedness and safety. They're so connected to nature that, probably because they experience like life and death on an everyday basis. We're so insulated from that. We are so insulated from the actual extremes of life and like what's going on even on the planet right at this very moment, that we shield ourselves from those vulnerabilities because we can. A lot of people don't have that option. If you're in Syria right now, you don't have that option to kind of just like not be vulnerable because you're forced. But we actually have this whole comfort thing, and we can experience what seems to be invulnerability. So and coupled with that, we have a society that really thinks that vulnerability is weakness. I would say the majority of our culture thinks that vulnerability is really a deep weakness. It's kind of like a cornerstone of the independence movement, is that you should be able to do everything on your own. You shouldn't need help. You definitely shouldn't be really grieving in front of people, all this sort of thing. So I think when anyone has a moment of allowing some of that programming and brainwashing to dissolve, there's a really deep transformation that's possible.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think when it comes to, because what we're talking about in all these different ways and things, I mean, at the core of it, it's kind of just emotion, right? And our lack and inability of expressing and being present in moments of emotion. And I think that, so if we break it down to where, and you could go like super spiritual in regards to like our chakras and all these different things. But for me, it's just like my brain exists to, basically move me throughout this physical world and this experience and process information and do all the different things that I need to do in order to be here. And then my heart is what's designed to process energy and the greater, expansiveness of everything that exists outside of this physical world. And I think that we somehow have to find that happy balance where we're connected to both of them and they're both working in conjunction with one another. But society has distanced themselves so much from, do you know what I mean? The process of feeling emotion and expressing emotion and being present in emotion. And I think that when we are in those spaces where we can feel things and express things, and vulnerability is a great one because so many people, men and women both, resist that. They don't want to feel that thing that we feel when we do, feel that vulnerability. But I think in those moments, that's when we're really connected to energy that exists and we're kind of tapping into it and we're processing it. And I think that's the important thing that we have to do.
Yeah, it seems, not to overstate delusions of grandeur or anything, but it seems pretty critical for our long-term survival. We are kind of hiding so much of our collective trauma. And it's funny, I think the kind of precipices that we're hitting politically and environmentally are actually serving to seep this stuff out, kind of leach it out of our unconscious. There's just so much of that trauma. And when you couple all of the trauma that everyone is walking around with from hundreds of years of unconditional love, non-unconditional, you could say conditional love, there's so much transformation possible just from people realizing that they can depend on each other again. And that the deepest strength that someone can have on the planet is when they know that they can depend on everybody else and they don't have to go everything alone. And that's something that feels, at least in my life, it really felt missing for a long time.
Yeah. I mean, I would agree. I think that, the vast majority of society probably avoids that. Like you said, everybody thinks that they have to be able to do it on their own. And I mean, when you get into it, thinking about not just these beliefs and these ideas, but how we have structured our life in such a way to where, do you know what I mean? That's almost becomes our belief where you have to be able to do everything on your own. And if you're not, then you're not successful or you're not worthy or you're not, somehow there's a part of you that's lacking when in reality, everything that we do in life is so much easier and better and more fulfilling if we incorporate other people into it.
And the whole idea that anyone's doing anything on their own is totally delusional in the first place, because you are not eating your bread alone, for sure. That one thing took 100 people to get into your refrigerator. Like, every single aspect of your life depends on every single other aspect of life on Earth, much less the cosmos. So in some sense, it really is this delusional stance to believe that any step anyone takes was ever done on their own.
Yeah. When it comes to the concept of time, what have you...
That's what we're going to start opening up now.
but in the especially in meditation and mindfulness and things like that, it's all about the focus of being present in the moment and letting go of, your thoughts shooting forward into the future or going backwards into the past. And for me, I've gotten to that point where I continually practice that idea and the concept that it is only now, that we don't have a future and we don't have a past, that we're only living, right now in the moment, and everything outside of that moment doesn't necessarily exist.
Mm. So, wait, was that a question or was it just
But I mean, it's challenging for me, right? To be in that space. And every time I try to talk to somebody about it, or a lot of times I'll go through stuff with my kids and try to get them to kind of grasp that concept of being in the moment. Then they always bring up, the past and history and events that they have learned about and things that we can call upon. And I mean, it's really easy for me to just simply remember yesterday. And so I don't know, I get stuck in it, right? I believe that it's all about the moment and that time doesn't exist on the linear fashion that we've, kind of been raised up believing, or the life that we've experienced, that it's much more dynamic.
Right.
What do you think?
Yeah, I really love the line that Einstein said, where he said, time and space are not conditions in which we live, but they are methods by which we think. And that has, there's a lot of mystics that will say the mind is time. And those kind of things really sit more and more deeply with me. I agree with you that it's not an easy thing for the mind to accept, almost because the whole purpose of the mind is time. It's to construct narrative through time, to look at causality, to see cause and effect, to see that if I do this thing, that it will give me this result later. But all of that is a certain form of pattern recognition. It's like, I saw this pattern, and then this thing happens when life is happening later. And, one riddle I like to ask people is, if past and future exist, then you should be able to go there right now. Can you go there right now? Because if you can't go there right now, then when could you ever go to the past and the future? Right? There's never actually a place that you can exist in the past and the future. You can imagine the past. You can imagine, like you said, yesterday. You have to do that right now. That imagination has to happen right now. There's images that flow through you right now to do that. There's experientially no way to live in the past or the future. And so I think maybe some of it comes down to distilling out the fact that there's a narrative self. There's the Jeff that was born 38 years ago, that grew up in Miami, all this sort of stuff. That's a narrative self. And then there's the experiencing self, which is me, which is the awareness that is perceiving this whole discussion and everything like that. That experiencing self can only exist in the present moment. There only is the present moment for it. But as it experiences, it constructs a temporal story about the narrative self. And it constantly refers to that story. This happened to me yesterday, this is going to happen to me tomorrow, all this sort of thing. And that's terribly useful. I think it's another one of these things where, how would we ever have built a plane if we weren't able to conceive of the future? However, the plane never exists in the future. The plane exists in the present when it's made. So it's this very weird kind of paradox. But as soon as you start to relax the possibility that time is a fundamental thing that you find in the universe, and instead start to imagine that it's a certain way of analyzing data that's happening, sense data, for me that really kind of changes the focus and has clarified something.
Yeah. Yeah, it's super clear. I totally know what you're talking about.
I'm not saying that the mind will ever be, like the time is an amazing tool and we need it. We need to schedule appointments and all that sort of thing. So it has a really deep function, and I don't think that people should get rid of that. But understanding and just kind of checking over and over that life never actually happens in the past and the future. That's, I think, the kind of insight is like, okay, anything that's ever going to happen in my life is going to happen in the present moment. It's going to happen at what I label as a different time, but when it's actually my life, it's going to be the present moment. And so it's more of a shift of attention. Like, I can't just imagine that life's always going to change at another time if I'm never actually acting on that in my life right now.
Yeah. So I have one more question for you, because you've been really generous with your time, and I appreciate it.
Yeah.
If you could come up with one thing that you think would benefit mankind as a whole on the planet, what would be kind of the thing that you would want to implement, or your wish or your dream that somehow would help society as a whole move forward and out of where we're kind of, sometimes it feels like we're stuck?
Here's my dream. My dream is that somehow the cool thing in high school becomes to be vulnerable. Where instead of being like the jock being cool, I don't even know what's cool anymore, obviously. It's been a long time since I've been in high school. I definitely was not the jock in high school. But, there's places like in South Korea, like if you're a math geek, you're cool there. That's like the cool thing. And obviously that has huge implications for what happens in society after years and years of that. My question is, what happens if kids and young adults are actually encouraged and find the joy of being vulnerable with each other and seeing that they can support each other through their openness to their own, I wouldn't even say weakness, I would say their own challenges. I think that if that could take off as like a viral structure in our culture, then that would just completely revolutionize our whole world in one generation.
Yeah.
And I think more and more about the time that I work on trying to uncover old trauma or stuck energy and all that sort of thing. And I think the longer we wait to do that, the more work we have to put into it. And so I think constantly about how can teenagers growing up, as they're ready for this kind of information, really be shown that kind of safety in culture, and what would the snowball effect be from that if suddenly you had millions of teenagers that actually felt totally okay having challenges and depending on the people around them for support.
Do you have kids yet?
I don't.
So
not yet.
Are you like, down the road at some point you'll have children?
It seems likely.
So you gotta, because I think that's where, obviously that's kind of where it starts. If we can teach our children how to process and feel emotion and be okay in the, in the emotion that they're processing, then I think that, would be a huge leap forward, because I know I failed as a parent. I've got 4 kids, and I look back at the way that I've kind of raised them, because they're kind of getting older and they're teenagers and things like that. There's so many things that I wish I would have done differently in simply just allowing them to process through the emotion and the experience, and both the things that we would label good and bad, and really just being vulnerable in those moments instead of always either rushing in to fix it for them immediately, or distancing them from it, where kind of not allowing them to process, shutting them down and things like that. But it's super challenging when you're once you start having kids. It's so hard to you have these concepts and ideas that you want to implement, and a lot of times it's in opposition from the way that you were raised, but then undoubtedly you'll fall back into some of those routines and patterns. And
Totally. There's an amazing resource, I think, for people along those lines, which is Patty Whippler started an organization called Hand in Hand Parenting. And just like what you were saying, she says, basically, I'm paraphrasing, taking liberties, but the entire function of a parent is to show the child that at all times they are connected. That's the only job. When a child has a tantrum, it's because they're trying to let out really deep fear about something, and you should just be there and weather the storm every time and just show them that you're there loving them, and that you never have to fix their problems. You just have to show them that there's someone there for them through their problems. And I think, just like you're saying, if someone grows up like that, how clear are the pipes in their nervous system for expression? How free will they feel moving through the world compared to someone who still feels terrified about everything? I think that's really deep. And I think there are also ways to bring that into the classroom. How do we teach people that didn't happen to have parents that did that? How do we let kids do this with each other in a safe environment? I think we've barely begun to tap the potential for people on their own in groups to kind of just revitalize themselves through this kind of work.
Yeah. Well, Jeff, I can't thank you enough. I had, like I said, I still have 1,001 questions that I want to ask you and go through stuff. And we didn't even get, I mean, you do so many amazing things. As I was kind of doing research on you and looking into everything, you're involved in a lot of really, really cool stuff. But if
we'll get it for another time.
Yeah. If people want to follow you or if they want to find anything about you, what's the easiest way?
My website is Beast, which is BEA.st. That has all my artwork and things like that. And they can also follow me on Facebook things where I post talks and that sort of work.
Well, wonderful, man. I really appreciate it.
Yeah. Thanks for looking out, Craig. Appreciate your time.
And everybody go out and have a beautiful, beautiful, wonderful day.
I think there's actually just as many people in our world that don't know how to express anger. And so they're actually expressing anger at themselves all the time because they're holding this thing in that doesn't feel safe to let out. Pure energy transmission through a human body, I think, is the natural state. At the end, the searcher disappears, and the only thing that's left is the search. There's so much transformation possible just from people realizing that they can depend on each other again, and that the deepest strength that someone can have on the planet is when they know that they can depend on everybody else.